Milton Snavely Hershey was born on September 13, 1857, in Derry Township, Pennsylvania, into a Mennonite farming family marked by financial instability and a father prone to speculative ventures that rarely succeeded. His formal education ended after the fourth grade, a common outcome for rural Pennsylvania boys of his era, and he was apprenticed instead to a printer in Gap, Pennsylvania, an arrangement that failed to hold his interest. An aunt who recognized his restlessness arranged for him to apprentice with a confectioner in Lancaster, and it was there, amid copper kettles and sugar syrups, that Hershey found the trade that would define the remainder of his life. His first independent attempts at candy making, in Philadelphia and later in Chicago, New Orleans, and New York, ended in financial failure across roughly 6 years of effort, leaving him in debt and, according to several biographical accounts, briefly disowned by extended family members who viewed him as an unreliable dreamer. These repeated failures are frequently compressed or skipped entirely in popular retellings of the Hershey story, yet they account for nearly a decade of his adult life and shaped the cautious, technically obsessive approach he later brought to chocolate manufacturing. He returned to Lancaster in 1883 with borrowed capital and a renewed determination to apply lessons learned from his earlier collapses rather than abandon the confectionery trade altogether. The Lancaster venture succeeded where the earlier ones had failed, largely because Hershey introduced a formula for caramels made with fresh milk rather than the paraffin-based recipes common at the time, a technical distinction that gave his product superior texture and shelf stability. The Lancaster Caramel Company grew rapidly through the 1880s and into the 1890s, eventually employing more than 1,300 workers across 2 factories and establishing Hershey for the first time as a serious industrial figure rather than a failed tradesman. Trade buyers in Britain reportedly placed substantial orders after sampling the caramels, providing the company with both capital and a degree of international credibility unusual for a confectioner based outside a major American city. This first venture is the part of the story most often treated as a mere prelude, yet it is the foundation on which everything else was built. It gave Hershey both the working capital and the manufacturing discipline that chocolate would later require at industrial scale. The fresh milk technique he refined here, originally developed to solve a caramel problem, would resurface a decade later as the central technical challenge of his chocolate enterprise, suggesting that his later breakthrough was less a sudden insight than the extension of a process he had already spent years mastering in a different product category. The pivotal turn came in 1893 when Hershey traveled to Chicago to attend the World's Columbian Exposition and encountered German-built chocolate manufacturing machinery on display from J.M. Lehman Company. Chocolate at that time was, in the United States, largely a luxury good produced in small batches by European-trained confectioners, priced beyond the reach of most working households. Hershey purchased the machinery on the spot and had it shipped to Lancaster, where he began producing chocolate coatings for his caramels as a subsidiary operation under the newly incorporated Hershey Chocolate Company of 1894. The decision reflected a recurring pattern in Hershey's career. Rather than entering an established market through imitation, he tended to acquire foreign industrial technology and redirect it toward a distinctly American price point and distribution scale. Contemporary accounts suggest that few American confectioners grasped, as early as Hershey did, that the machinery on display in Chicago was not simply a novelty, but the technical basis for an entirely new category of mass-market food product. Over the next several years, while the caramel business continued to generate revenue, Hershey directed an internal research effort toward a specific technical problem: how to mass-produce milk chocolate using fresh milk rather than the condensed or powdered milk used in Swiss formulations by makers such as Lindt and Peter. Fresh milk introduced complications, including high moisture content and a tendency toward rancidity that threatened both flavor and shelf life across distribution. Through a process of sustained trial and error between roughly 1895 and 1899, Hershey and his small technical staff developed a method of condensing skim milk in closed kettles with controlled sugar ratios, producing a stable, taffy-like base that could be blended with chocolate liqueur at scale. This formulation, sometimes referred to informally as the Hershey process, was not the invention of milk chocolate itself, since European manufacturers had been producing it for decades, but it was a specifically American solution to manufacturing milk chocolate cheaply, reliably, and at a volume no domestic competitor had yet matched. The precise details of the formula were treated as a closely guarded internal matter, and some specifics of the original 1899 process remain known primarily through company archives rather than fully independent verification, a point worth noting rather than glossing over. In August 1900, Hershey sold the Lancaster Caramel Company for approximately $1 million, a substantial sum for the period, and used the proceeds to fully commit to chocolate production. That same year, the Hershey Chocolate Company introduced the Hershey's Milk Chocolate Bar, sold at 5 cents, a price point deliberately set to place a previously elite product within reach of ordinary American consumers, including children, factory workers, and farm families who had rarely, if ever, purchased imported European chocolate. The 5-cent bar is frequently cited by business historians as one of the earliest and most successful examples of mass-market democratization of a luxury good in American industrial history, comparable in concept, though not in scale, to later mass production stories in other industries. Demand outpaced the capacity of the existing Lancaster facilities almost immediately, confirming that Hershey had correctly judged both the price elasticity and the latent appetite of the American consumer for a product previously associated with imported sophistication rather than everyday consumption. Hershey began searching for a site capable of supporting a manufacturing operation of unprecedented scale for confectionery, and he selected farmland near his birthplace in Derry Township, reasoning that proximity to dairy farms would secure a stable, high-quality milk supply, a logistical consideration that would later prove central to the brand's quality control and regional identity. Construction began in 1903 on what was, at the time of its completion in 1905, described by trade publications as the largest chocolate manufacturing plant in the world, a facility engineered specifically around the continuous process techniques Hershey had spent a decade refining. The site selection was as much an agricultural decision as an industrial one, since the surrounding farmland could be contracted directly for milk supply, reducing dependence on distant or unreliable dairy networks that had complicated production in Lancaster. The resulting plant combined raw material intake, processing, and packaging within a single integrated complex, a layout that was considered advanced for food manufacturing at the time, and that significantly reduced the handling losses common in multi-site confectionery operations. The factory did not exist in isolation. Around it, Hershey constructed an entire planned community that the company itself, and later many regional historians, would refer to as a model industrial town. Workers' homes were built with electricity, indoor plumbing, and central heating at a time when many rural Pennsylvania households lacked these amenities, and the town included a public trolley system, parks, a community center, and free schooling for employees' children. This was not philanthropy in the conventional sense, so much as a deliberate labor strategy. Hershey understood that a stable, healthy, loyal workforce situated near reliable dairy supply was a competitive asset, and the town was structured to retain skilled labor in a rural area that might otherwise have struggled to attract it. The town and the factory together represented an integration of manufacturing, housing, transportation, and civic life that few American industrialists attempted on a comparable scale. And it remains a frequently studied case in discussions of company-town urban planning in the United States. Contemporary accounts and later labor histories note that Hershey, Pennsylvania, while materially generous by the standards of early 20th century company towns, was not free of the paternalistic control common to such arrangements. A documented 1937 sit-down strike by chocolate workers, addressing wage and working condition grievances, indicates that labor relations were not without friction even within this idealized framework, despite the town's reputation for employee welfare. The strike occurred during a period of broader American labor unrest, tied to the rise of industrial unionism, and it is generally treated by labor historians as evidence that company-provided amenities, however genuine, did not eliminate the underlying tensions between management and workforce common to large manufacturing operations of the period. This nuance is frequently absent from promotional or celebratory accounts of Hershey, Pennsylvania, yet it forms a necessary corrective to any account that treats the town purely as a benevolent utopia, rather than a functioning, occasionally contentious, industrial community.
In 1909, Milton and his wife Catherine, who had no children of their own, established a deed of trust creating what is now known as the Milton Hershey School, an institution originally founded to provide free education, housing, and vocational training to orphaned boys. The trust was eventually endowed with the bulk of Hershey's personal fortune, including, over subsequent decades, controlling ownership of Hershey Chocolate Company stock itself, an arrangement that created a unique and at the time unusual corporate structure, a publicly traded confectionery company whose controlling shareholder was a charitable trust dedicated to child welfare, rather than a family dynasty or outside investor group. This structure has had lasting consequences for corporate governance that persist into the present day, since major strategic decisions, including any potential sale of the company, require the trust's approval, embedding philanthropic oversight directly into corporate strategy in a way few public companies experience. The school today serves several thousand students from disadvantaged backgrounds at no cost to their families, funded by a trust whose value has been estimated in various public filings at well over $15 billion, though precise figures fluctuate with market conditions and are disputed in various legal proceedings.
The arrangement reflects Hershey's stated personal philosophy, attributed to him in multiple biographical sources, that wealth accumulated without children to inherit it should be directed toward the welfare of children who had no family at all, though the degree to which this framing fully captures his motivations remains a matter of historical interpretation rather than settled fact. Product expansion continued steadily through the early 20th century. Hershey's Kisses, individually wrapped drops of milk chocolate, were introduced in 1907, and the company added cacao bean processing facilities, eventually integrating backward into raw material sourcing to reduce dependence on outside suppliers, a vertical integration strategy common among large industrial firms of the period, seeking to control cost and quality simultaneously. This backward integration meant that, unlike many competitors who purchased finished or semi-finished chocolate liquor from specialized processors, Hershey controlled a larger share of its supply chain directly, from roasting through final molding, a structural advantage that supported both cost control and consistency of product as volume increased. The expanding product catalog during this period also began to establish brand recognition strategies, including standardized foil wrapping and consistent paper label design that distinguished Hershey's output on store shelves, increasingly crowded with competing confectionery brands entering the same affordable price tier. Hershey Chocolate Company became a publicly traded corporation in 1927, formally separating day-to-day operational governance from Milton Hershey's personal control, even as the trust retained majority ownership, a transition that occurred as Hershey himself was easing out of daily management in his later years.
Despite this formal separation, Milton Hershey continued to direct major civic and construction initiatives in the town that bore his name well into the 1930s, blurring the line between personal philanthropy and corporate identity in ways that would have been unusual for executives of comparably sized public companies elsewhere in American industry. The 1927 listing gave the company access to public capital markets for the first time, supporting further plant expansion, while the trust's retained controlling stake ensured that no outside acquirer could gain effective control without the trust's consent, a safeguard that would prove significant in later corporate history.
The onset of the Great Depression in 1929 devastated much of American industry, but Hershey's position as a low-cost, high-volume confectioner proved comparatively resilient, since affordable chocolate remained within reach of consumers even as discretionary spending collapsed elsewhere. Rather than retrenching, Milton Hershey initiated what is commonly referred to as the Great Building Campaign, directing construction of the Hotel Hershey, the Hershey Community Building, the Hershey Theater, and later additions to Hershey Park, explicitly framing the projects as employment programs for townspeople who might otherwise have gone without work. Hershey is widely quoted across multiple biographical and journalistic sources as having said that if he did not provide work for the town's residents, he would have to feed them instead, and that since building costs were at historic lows during the downturn, construction was the more dignified option. This period is frequently cited by business historians and, more selectively, by political commentators as an example of private industrial paternalism functioning as an informal social safety net, though the broader applicability of this single case to general economic policy is a matter of ongoing debate rather than a settled lesson, and should be understood within the specific and somewhat unusual circumstances of a company town with a single dominant employer. By the mid-1930s, Hershey Chocolate Company had become a fixture of the American diet, well beyond its original 5-cent bar. But its next major transformation arrived through an unlikely customer, the United States military. In 1937, Army Quartermaster Colonel Paul Logan approached Hershey executives, including company president William Murray and chief chemist Sam Hinkle, with a request for an emergency field ration bar meeting 4 specific criteria. Namely that it weigh 4 ounces, deliver high caloric density, withstand high ambient temperatures without melting, and, in a frequently repeated phrase attributed to the Army's request, taste only slightly better than a boiled potato, a deliberately unappealing threshold intended to discourage troops from consuming the ration as a casual snack rather than reserving it for genuine emergencies. Hershey's chemists developed a dense bar combining chocolate, sugar, oat flour, cacao fat, and skim milk powder, fortified with thiamine to help prevent the nutritional deficiency disease beriberi among troops on restricted diets. The resulting mixture was so viscous that it could not pass through standard chocolate bar production equipment, requiring each bar to be hand-packed into its mold during initial production runs, an unusual reversion to manual labor inside a factory built explicitly around continuous mechanized process. This product, designated Field Ration D, entered mass production as the United States moved toward involvement in the Second World War, and Hershey's facilities were substantially redirected toward military contracts for the duration of the conflict. Soldier accounts collected by historians and military archives describe the bar's taste in consistently unfavorable terms, with some troops nicknaming it derisively in reference to its harsh effect on digestion. And its density was such that soldiers reportedly shaved slices from the bar with knives rather than biting it directly, particularly in cold conditions when it became nearly solid. Despite, or arguably because of, its unpalatability, the ration achieved its intended purpose as genuine emergency sustenance rather than a recreational treat. And by 1943, the Army requested a second, more palatable variant for troops in the Pacific Theater, leading to the development of the Hershey's Tropical Bar, formulated to resist melting in high humidity and heat while offering somewhat improved flavor over the original D ration. By the end of the war, Hershey's production lines had manufactured more than 3 billion ration bars for the United States Armed Forces, a scale of output that placed the company's Pennsylvania factory among the most strategically significant food production sites in the Allied war effort, a role rarely emphasized in popular accounts of the brand, but well documented in military supply records and company archives. The post-war decades brought sustained growth, brand diversification, and the steady embedding of Hershey's products into mainstream American consumer culture, from school lunchboxes to holiday traditions, without a single transformation as dramatic as the wartime ration contracts, but with a consistent accumulation of market presence. The company's acquisition of the H.B. Reese Candy Company in 1963 brought the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, originally created by a former Hershey employee, Harry Burnett Reese, into the corporate portfolio, eventually making it one of the best-selling candy products in the United States, and demonstrating the company's willingness to grow through acquisition of complementary brands rather than relying solely on organic product development. The acquisition is frequently noted by business historians as a case in which a former employee's independent venture, built in part on a supply relationship with his former employer, was eventually absorbed back into the parent company, illustrating the close and sometimes circular relationships common within a single industry company town. Hershey's continued to expand its manufacturing footprint and its product lines through the latter half of the 20th century, entering categories including baking products, beverages, and snack foods, while maintaining its core identity as a chocolate and confectionery manufacturer rooted in central Pennsylvania.
International expansion proceeded more cautiously than that of some global competitors, such as Nestle or Mars, with Hershey historically deriving a larger share of its revenue from the domestic United States market than many of its peers, a strategic choice that left the company comparatively exposed to swings in the North American confectionery market, while reducing its exposure to currency and geopolitical risk abroad. By the close of the 20th century, the company had become one of the largest chocolate manufacturers in the world by revenue, though still substantially smaller in global footprint than Mars or Nestle, a distinction occasionally lost in popular accounts that treat Hershey as the dominant global chocolate brand rather than the dominant American one. Corporate governance complications tied to the Milton Hershey School Trust became a matter of significant public attention in 2002, when the Trust's Board of Managers, citing a stated need to diversify the Trust's heavily concentrated holdings in a single company, explored a potential sale of Hershey Foods Corporation to a larger conglomerate. The proposal triggered intense local and national opposition from Hershey, Pennsylvania residents, school alumni, and labor representatives who viewed the sale as a betrayal of Milton Hershey's founding intent and a threat to the town's economic identity, prompting more than 6,500 individuals to petition the Pennsylvania Attorney General to intervene. Facing this pressure and an Attorney General's office prepared to act, the Trust's board voted 10-7 to withdraw the proposed sale, preserving the company's independence, but leaving unresolved questions about the Trust's investment concentration that would resurface in later years. This episode is generally regarded by corporate governance scholars as a notable instance in which a controlling charitable trust's fiduciary obligations to its beneficiaries came into direct and public tension with a surrounding community's economic and emotional attachment to the underlying company, a tension not fully resolved by the 2002 decision alone.
Further governance turbulence followed in the 2010s, when the Hershey Trust Board became embroiled in internal disputes, with various public reporting and legal filings describing extended litigation among trustees, executive compensation controversies, and allegations of financial mismanagement that drew renewed scrutiny from the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. Separately, the Milton Hershey School itself faced public criticism over its admissions practices, including a widely reported 2011 case in which the school's initial rejection of a student because he was HIV positive drew national media attention and a subsequent legal settlement, an episode frequently cited in discussions of the school's institutional culture during that period. These controversies are documented across multiple journalistic and legal sources, though characterizations of their severity and of individual responsibility vary, and some matters were resolved through settlement rather than adjudicated findings of fact, a distinction worth preserving when assessing the available public record, rather than treating every allegation as proven.
In recent decades, the most consistent source of public scrutiny directed at Hershey, as with other major chocolate manufacturers, including Mars and Nestle, has concerned the company's cocoa supply chain, the majority of which originates in West Africa, particularly Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. Multiple human rights organizations and investigative reports, along with a 2023 lawsuit filed by international rights advocates, have alleged that cocoa entering Hershey's supply chain has in some instances been cultivated using child labor, including hazardous tasks performed by minors on small independent farms that supply the broader regional cocoa market. Industry-wide estimates cited in various reports suggest that more than 1.5 million children are engaged in some form of cocoa-related labor across Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire combined, though such figures are derived from survey methodologies that researchers themselves describe as imperfect, given the informal and dispersed nature of smallholder cocoa farming. Hershey has stated that it began sourcing Rainforest Alliance certified cocoa for select product lines in 2012 and expanded certification commitments across its broader portfolio by 2020, while also funding child labor monitoring and remediation programs that the company reports identified thousands of cases of inappropriate child labor for intervention. Critics, including several of the advocacy groups involved in the litigation, contend that voluntary certification and monitoring programs have not eliminated the underlying economic pressures that drive child labor on cocoa farms, and that industry pricing practices have at times undermined efforts such as the living income differential intended to raise farmer incomes. This remains a genuinely contested and unresolved area, with company statements and advocacy assessments offering materially different pictures of progress.
The company's financial position in the mid-2020s has been shaped substantially by extraordinary volatility in global cocoa prices, which more than doubled between late 2023 and the end of 2024 due to a combination of adverse weather conditions, crop disease, and sustained global demand outpacing West African supply. Hershey reported net sales of approximately $11.2 billion for fiscal year 2024, a modest year-over-year increase, alongside net income of roughly $2.2 billion, even as the underlying cost environment deteriorated sharply. Company guidance for fiscal 2025 anticipated continued sales growth in the low single digits, while forecasting a substantial decline in earnings per share, attributing the pressure directly to historically elevated cocoa, sugar, and labor costs that the company sought to offset through pricing adjustments, reformulation of certain products, and expanded hedging and supply diversification strategies. Industry analysts covering the confectionery sector have characterized this period as one of the most difficult cost environments the company has faced in decades, distinct from prior challenges in that it stems from structural supply constraints in cocoa-growing regions rather than from cyclical demand softness, raising open questions about long-term sourcing strategy that remain unresolved as of this account.
Considered across more than a century, the Hershey story occupies a position in American industrial history that is neither purely celebratory nor purely critical, but genuinely layered. The company is credited with reasonable historical support for converting a European luxury good into an affordable staple of American daily life, for pioneering specific manufacturing techniques suited to fresh milk chocolate at industrial scale, for sustaining a community through the Great Depression via deliberate construction employment, and for supplying a strategically significant food product to American forces during the Second World War. It is simultaneously a company whose controlling trust has faced documented governance disputes, whose supply chain has been the subject of credible and still partially unresolved human rights concerns originating thousands of miles from Pennsylvania, and whose current financial trajectory is now bound tightly to commodity markets shaped by conditions in West Africa rather than decisions made in Hershey, Pennsylvania itself. Both dimensions belong in any sober accounting of the brand's legacy, and neither should be allowed to fully eclipse the other.
What remains consistent across all of these chapters is the underlying structural fact established by Milton Hershey himself, a chocolate company built around a charitable trust, embedded in a planned company town, whose fortunes have never been entirely separable from questions of labor, welfare, and obligation extending well beyond the factory floor, a structure unusual enough among American corporations that it continues to generate scholarly and journalistic attention more than a century after its creation.